In the east, following a successful offensive, the Red Army reached the borders of East Prussia and established bridgeheads on the Vistula River. In the west, Allied forces had advanced close to the Siegfried Line, a defensive fortification on Germany's border. However, after a string of successes in the summer of 1944, the Allied advance faltered on all fronts. The Anglo-American forces were compelled to halt their push due to overextended supply lines and reserves that lagged far behind. As they neared the Third Reich's borders, the front lines compressed, allowing the Wehrmacht to hold them with fewer troops. The Germans clearly intended to wear down the Allied army through defense on their formidable border fortifications. Germany, in essence, was betting on a prolonged war of attrition. However, to the surprise of the general staff officers, in September of 1944, Hitler, on his own initiative, decided to launch a counteroffensive in the Ardennes, attempting to alter the war's course. The operations plan was to cleave the Allied forces into two with a powerful, swift strike, cross the Meuse River, and capture the crucial supply base of Antwerp. Subsequently, they aimed to encircle and annihilate the Allied forces in Belgium and the Netherlands. The operation was codenamed Watch on the Rhine. Hitler was counting on internal coalition discord, believing that a successful offensive would allow him to drive the Anglo-American troops into the Atlantic and impose a separate peace on the Allies under his terms. Following this, he could redeploy all forces to the Eastern Front and halt the Red Army's advance. Furthermore, seizing Antwerp would drastically worsen the supply situation for Allied troops on Germany's border. Knowing that the Western Allies had deciphered German codes and were reading all orders even before they reached the troops, the German High Command prepared the Ardennes offensive in utmost secrecy, transmitting orders via telephone and couriers. The main thrust was intended for a quiet sector of the front where the Americans and British did not anticipate any offensive actions from the Germans, a sector where their battle-weary troops were sent for rest. In the Ardennes, a 72-mile stretch of front was defended by only 4 divisions. In total, 3 armies from Army Group B, under Field Marshal Model's command, were planned to participate in the German offensive. Air support was to be provided by 800 aircraft. A significant flaw in Hitler's plan was the lack of material and human resources for an operation of this magnitude. Germany was experiencing a severe fuel shortage, which could only be rectified by the rapid capture of Liège and Namur, where gasoline depots were located. Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, noted that the calculated fuel reserves for tanks were sufficient for only half the planned distance. Simultaneously, the surprise and ferocity of the attack were meant to compensate for the deficiency in troops and material, while inclement weather would shield them from Allied air activity. On the morning of December 16, 1944, after a powerful artillery barrage, German forces launched their offensive. The main blow fell upon 2 American divisions, one of which had no combat experience, and the other was severely depleted. Columns of German tanks advanced, preceded by English-speaking commandos led by Otto Skorzeny, who in captured jeeps, wearing American uniforms and armed with American weapons, infiltrated behind enemy lines. They managed to seize crucial bridges and overrun headquarters, thereby disrupting command and control. Additionally, a German airborne landing was attempted behind American lines in the Ardennes. However, due to unfavorable weather, the drop was unsuccessful. Initially, the 5th Panzer Army, under General von Manschenfeld, achieved the greatest success, penetrating deep into enemy territory and reaching the strategically important town of Bastogne by the 3rd day of the operation. Approximately 30,000 Allied soldiers and officers in the Ardennes were taken prisoner. American war correspondent Ralph Ingersoll later described it as, "They broke through our defensive line for 50 miles and poured into this breach like water into a burst dam, and they fled west along all the roads leading west." The commander of the 1st U.S. Army, General Hodges, only realized the gravity of the threat on the morning of December 17th, when the Germans were already nearing his headquarters. The German offensive in the Ardennes caught the Allies completely off guard, leading to utter confusion, and in the initial days, they were unable to offer significant resistance. However, due to severe weather conditions, difficult terrain, supply problems, and the declining quality of troops by the war's end, not everything went smoothly for the Germans. After a brilliant start, the Watch on the Rhine operation began to falter. The primary obstacle was the 10th U.S. Airborne Division, defending the town of Bastogne. The German 5th Panzer Army repeatedly attacked the town from various directions, but failed to capture it. The defense of this town seriously hindered the German advance, as 7 major roads in the Ardennes, essential for Wehrmacht supply lines, converged there. For 5 days, the Germans were unable to capture another vital road junction, the town of St. Vith, where units of the 7th U.S. Armored Division held their ground tenaciously. Although the American forces eventually retreated and abandoned the town, they slowed the German advance and allowed the Allies to redeploy additional troops to the Ardennes. Meanwhile, the 7th Army of the Wehrmacht, protecting the left flank of the attacking group, failed to breach the Allied defenses. The Germans came within a few kilometers of the river. Only a forward detachment of Germans, the SS unit led by Joachim Paper, managed to get sufficiently close to the river. However, due to a lack of fuel, his tank stalled. Later, Hitler also paid for his decision to give the main role to the right wing of the 6th Panzer Army, which was predominantly comprised of SS units. However, he failed to realize that the terrain here was significantly more challenging and the density of Allied forces was much greater. Even if the Germans had reached the bridges over the Meuse, they were already mined by British sappers. On December 19th, a meeting of Allied command took place in Verdun, where a joint plan for counteraction was approved. The Third Army, under General Patton, was redeployed south, and its offensive began 2 days later. Weather conditions improved, and Allied aircraft appeared in vast numbers, inflicting significant losses on German formations. By December 26th, the leading elements of the 3rd U.S. Army reached the besieged Bastogne, which the Germans had failed to capture despite the redeployment of 2 SS Panzer Corps to this sector. On the same day, the German command began preparing to transfer 2 infantry divisions from the west to Hungary. By this time, Hitler clearly understood that Antwerp would not be captured, and the further offensive pursued only limited objectives to prevent the Anglo-American forces from creating strike groups for an offensive. However, the Germans had another surprise in store for the Western Allies. On the morning of January 1st, 1945, approximately 1,300 aircraft, including the latest jet fighters, the Messerschmitt Me-262, launched a surprise attack on Allied airfields in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Within a few hours, 500 American and British aircraft were damaged or destroyed, and the airfields were put out of commission. From a military perspective, however, the operation ended in failure for the Germans, as the Allied industrial capacity could quickly compensate for the losses, whereas losing nearly 300 aircraft made this far more difficult. On the same day, the Germans launched a localized offensive in Alsace, in the Strasbourg area, aimed at diverting Allied forces. Nevertheless, Wehrmacht units still controlled a dangerous salient in the front line. Allied command decided to encircle the German grouping with 2 converging thrusts from the north and south. The U.S. Army was only 40 kilometers away from achieving this. On January 3rd, 1945, Anglo-American forces launched a full-scale offensive against German positions. However, despite the disruption of Hitler's plan, the Allied situation remained quite complex. Commander of the 3rd U.S. Army, George Patton, accused the Air Force in his diary on January 3rd. "We still have a chance to lose this war." In the following days, Churchill telegraphed Stalin, "I have just returned from visiting, separately, the headquarters of General Eisenhower and Field Marshal Montgomery. The battle in Belgium is very severe. Very heavy fighting is taking place in the West. On January 7th, General of the Army Eisenhower candidly wrote in an operational report to his Secretary of War, "The Germans are making maximum, determined efforts to achieve victory in the West in the shortest possible time." However, by January 9th, the mood among the Allies had dramatically changed. Clearly relaxed and visibly pleased, Churchill wrote to Stalin, "The battle in the West is not going too badly." However, there were obvious reasons for this. On January 8th, Hitler dismissed the commander of the Western Front, Field Marshal von Rundstedt, and ordered an immediate withdrawal of troops to their initial positions. Within an hour, units of the 6th SS Panzer Army executed a 180-degree turn and began a hasty retreat eastward. Divisions from Dietrich's army were rapidly redeployed to the Eastern Front for a counteroffensive in Hungary, aimed at relieving the besieged Budapest. Thus, even before the start of the Soviet offensive on the Vistula, the German offensive in the Ardennes had already been halted. 2 days after the start of the Soviet offensive in Poland, units of the 1st and 3rd U.S. armies joined forces north of Bastogne, in the vicinity of the towns of Wiltz and Longvally, thereby eliminating more than half of the Ardennes salient. On January 23rd, the 1st U.S. Army liberated the town of St. Vith, and on the 28th, the Germans retreated to their initial positions. Both in the Ardennes and Alsace, the German counteroffensive ended in failure, failing to achieve its objectives. The Wehrmacht lost over a third of its armored vehicles and almost all of its aircraft in the fighting. In reality, the Germans only managed to postpone the Allied offensive on the Rhine by a mere 6 weeks. At the same time, the Ardennes operation became the bloodiest battle in U.S. history. According to various estimates, Allied losses in the Ardennes operation, including killed, wounded, and captured, exceeded 100,000 men. Losses in armored vehicles were no less significant. Americans lost about 800 tanks and self-propelled guns. German losses resulting from the counteroffensive totaled 67,000 men, of whom a significant portion were irretrievable. Regarding the impact, it is important to note that 5 armor divisions, several infantry divisions, and tank brigades were withdrawn from the Western Front, but only 2 infantry and 1 motorized division were sent to repel the Soviet offensive in Poland. The main forces were intended for the counteroffensive in Hungary, conceived even before the start of the Vistula-Oder operation. The Soviet offensive undoubtedly aided the Americans in their efforts. However, even without this counteroffensive, the Germans no longer had a chance to achieve their goals in the Ardennes and Alsace. At the same time, it was critically important for Hitler to retain the oil fields in western Hungary and eastern Austria, which is why, on the 5th day of the offensive in the Ardennes, the Germans began redeploying their divisions to the Eastern Front. Furthermore, if Soviet forces had taken Budapest and Vienna, it would have destroyed the entire German continental defense system. The German gamble in the Ardennes so stunned Allied command that they did not return to offensive operations on the Western Front until March 1945. The chief of the General Staff, Guderian, had advocated for the cancellation of the operation on the Western Front from the very beginning, arguing that time and resources were being diverted from the Eastern Front. But Hitler stubbornly insisted on his plan. As a result, the Germans never managed to regain strategic initiative on the Western Front.